Hi, and welcome to Comic Talk. I'm Joshua.
And I'm Drew.
And this week we're going to talk about the Kents. This is John Ostrander from 99. It's big.
It's a big one.
It's a big old trade thing. And we're back.
We sure are, Josh.
So, this is John Ostrander's The Kents. It has a couple different artists on it. Does it have the artists on the cover? Because I don't ever remember their names.
Timothy Truman, Tom Mandrake, and Michael Blair.
And this is a Western, which...
A historical.
Oh, a very historical Western, which... Can I just start by saying that I was very skeptical of this going in?
Yeah, me too.
Which I imagine a lot of people probably are.
Mm-hmm. The only reason I had interest in this whatsoever was because John Ostrander wrote it.
Right.
Period.
Right. This seems like one of those things where it's you tie in the Kents and you make it this weird Superman analogy thing that could be really easily ham-fisted really badly, right? So I really, and even the cover of it makes me go,
Yeah.
I don't know. So what is this? Can you explain it a little?
It's really a bunch of like pre-Civil War and Civil War events centered in Kansas. Of course, around the Kent family, that's who we're dealing with. And it's just, from that point, aside from all the dense historical stuff, which does get pretty dense in here, it really comes down to a character drama.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is, in my opinion, this is straight up spaghetti Western.
Yeah.
Is what we got. This is morally ambiguous characters. A lot of these characters are very morally ambiguous.
Not the main ones, though.
Nate is not, but almost everyone else is very ambiguous. Even his friends, the people he deals with.
Yeah,
right?
his brother. We'll get to that later.
Right.
Okay.
And there's a lot of these morally ambiguous characters in this very sweeping, epic, long tale, and I really liked it.
I did too.
Yeah.
There were a little bits, and I think it's just because we're basically from the area where I was like, okay, well, hello, fucking fifth grade, revisiting all this shit that's been just hammered into us.
Yeah, we should.
It's part of our history.
We should mention that we are from Kansas. We live in Wichita, Kansas.
We eat at fucking Spangles.
Spangles.
Okay? Y'all don't know about that shit.
You don't. You should. But so for me, that was actually a plus. I really liked it. I felt immediately at home with what's going on with the characters and where they're at. Like just knowing the locations and how they relate to one another, knowing where Hayes is compared to Lawrence. These kind of things really helped me a lot. So I am a little bit reticent to immediately think that everyone would enjoy this as much as me for the same reasons because of that.
Yeah. And I kind of have the same opinion about, I don't want to say that I didn't like it because I very much liked it, but the little bits where I felt it was just too historical and just, took me back to classes in school that I didn't want to go to. I don't think necessarily everybody would have that same experience,
right?
Because depending on where you grew up, like if you grew up in Alabama, like that's going to be what you study usually in like your Civil War study thing, or if you grew up in the North, you're going to study that. So, but it is like extremely, like he did his homework on this. I'm very impressed. Yeah. He must have been on like a super Civil War kick and then just had to find a vehicle to write something for it. And that's what he did. Right.
And it is one of those things though, like, a good example, Wild Bill Hickok is in this quite a bit.
Yeah, I love all the like historical continuity. Like, just interject these.
Like Wild Bill Hickok, he is my wife's mother's like great uncle or great uncle, something like that. You know what I mean? Like so. For people here, we all know about Wild Bill Hickok, and
his
we know about John Brown. Like we know these characters pretty pretty heavily, so that does figure into it. But there's a lot more to it than that. I just wanted to get that disclaimer out of the way before we dig into it. Because really what this is, I think this stands really well completely aside from the fact that it has anything to do with Superman or the DC universe.
What's his name? Jonah Hex was in here. I was a bit confused. He was on the Confederate side of the army. It seems like an odd choice, but anyway.
Yeah, but he, there's very little reference, and really the only thing that connects this to them is the name. Obviously, it's Jonathan Kent's, great-grandparents or whatever they are. And something that actually works really well, which is Jonathan Kent narrating at the beginning of each section. The setup here is that he finds a box, like a metal box of all these letters.
And he's trying to piece them together chronologically.
And he's piecing them together and sending them off to Clark because he thinks they're interesting, and he knows Clark is a history buff. And so he's putting them together and sends them to Clark and then tells him a little bit about, what he knows about it. And in that, we get the vehicle to tell us these things, right?
And it's also it's a clever Wade page in a lot of ways. It'll catch you up to the story. Like, I could have come in, a couple issues behind on this and been fine. Right.
But it works incredibly well. And you only see Superman, Clark Kent, a small handful of times, and he's not doing Superman stuff. He's just
wearing glasses.
He's just Clark, and he's just reading the letter. And when you do see the characters, really it's mostly Jonathan Kent, and he's an old man, and he's hanging out in his barn, and he's writing letters. But this very, very heavily is about the past. And these aren't superhero characters, and this is not a superhero story at all.
I mean, it has some of the elements of one, again, with like the historical continuity and tie-ins and stuff like that. I mean, there are some like little nods to the genre in some ways, but if you weren't a fan of the genre, you probably wouldn't catch them. I'll put it that way.
Right. And a lot of it has to do just with the most superhero-y or comic booky kind of thing that I found in here is the connections to everything, right? Like Nate and Jeb and Silas, like these main characters, are somehow connected to like every important figure from that era. Like John Wilkes Booth and Wild Bill Hickok and John Brown, and just on and on and on, like all of these, General Custer, right? All of these characters somehow they interact with, which is really hard to buy unless you understand that it's in the DC world where these sort of fate-like things happen to people. And once you're okay with that central conceit, everything else about this is very much an old school spaghetti western type story.
I would say it's also, I've been thinking about this a little bit, very much a coming of age story for Jeb. And I really like the way that it was put together. So I think we should talk a little bit about the characters, because they're the central thing in this. So,
and let's try to do that first. As unspoilery as possible. We'll reach a point here on the video where we'll move to spoilers. Can we do that? Or should we just say this is the spoiler point?
This is probably the spoiler
Is there anything we want to say to people who don't want to be spoiled, who might want to shut off before we continue and go read this? I think the only other thing I'd like to say is that this meanders about in a way that I love in a Western. I'm a Western fan. I like Westerns, but I've never read a good comic book Western.
Sure.
And I think the one thing that this adds to the genre that you don't normally get in film especially is we get the nice, and you can't get in a Western novel and you can't get it in film, and this is what comic books often do that's so great, is you get the visuals that I love from like Leone type stuff, these big sweeping vistas and the drama of seeing characters and how they interact with one another.
But you also get the pacing of like a novel.
You get the novel pacing, and you get the monologue, the interior dialogue of characters as they're talking about what they're doing. And this is very heavy on like the interior monologue and the dialogue and the thoughts of these characters.
Sure. It's a slow burn, so
it's very slow.
Be prepared for that when you go into it.
All right, so let's get into spoiler mode, and let's really deconstruct this thing a little.
Which character would you like to talk about first?
I think we should probably start talking just about Nate, because he is the main lead character of the story.
Yeah, if there is like a character to say, well, that's like the Superman of his time, it's probably him.
He even kind of looks Superman-y.
Right. How did you feel about him?
I liked the character. I thought he was just morally ambiguous enough to have a good weighty feel to him.
See, that's where I got a little bit lost, because yes, I would agree, like, there's the moral ambiguity, and yes, I would agree that there's also like the Superman allegory, but the way that they're pieced together makes me really not like him. Like, he did some really bad shit in this, and just kind of like, he's like, well, we did it one time, and then I said after that I'm never gonna do it again, and then he just walks away from it. And so I don't feel that he necessarily grew that much as a character, and that really pisses me off when characters just like don't learn shit. And it pisses me off that he was the good guy.
I normally agree, but that's something that I love about a lot of great Westerns, is I think a lot of the central narrative in a Western, or really the antagonism that happens in a Western, isn't so much, like, the antagonist often isn't a specific character, right? The central theme of antagonism often in a Western is that it's this pull between who a person wants to be and the circumstances that they find themselves in.
Right.
And trying to work between those, and how, a good Western, especially of this type, really tends to drag people a little too far from where they're like out of their comfort zone, and show them doing things that they would not like to do.
Right.
And I think that accomplished this really well.
At the same time, though, we didn't get a lot of like afterward regret and stuff from him, which in my mind, like, a protagonist should have. Which is why I think I didn't like him as a character, but Jeb, I feel like, for all of his faults and all the terrible shit he did, every time after he did something terrible, you could tell it was just like another weight, and it was just, he was always bringing it up and saying, I can't believe I did this, but I just have to like move on with my life now and whatever. But he just like keeps coming back to all this shit that's like piling up on him, and just revisiting it in his head, and trying to decide if he's at a point where he can turn back or whatever. And yeah, Nate did some shit that was just as bad as Jeb. Right. But he doesn't have that coming back to it and saying, like, I'll never be the same man again because I've done this. Right.
Right. Well, yeah. But that's exactly what I liked so much about the dichotomy of the characters, is that, like, Jeb really it feels throughout, as it's written here, that Jeb seems to really languish and feel the things that he does. When he makes a mistake, it really weighs on him to a degree that it leads him to more mistakes. Whereas Nate seems like the good guy, but when he makes a mistake, he can move on and continue to be the good guy, because in a way he's not as emotionally invested as Jeb.
Yeah, it reminds me of what's that, Faulkner? As I Lie Dying, there was June, and Daryl, I think, was the other brother. And most criticisms of the book have painted like June to be like the good guy, and then the other one was like the bad guy. But if you read it, like, the whole thing is about their mom died, and they have to like, make a casket for her and then go bury her. And June is just like totally morally detached like the whole time, and just like very cold and like matter of fact and everything. And the other brother's like losing his shit, like, crying all over the place and being irrational and shit. And it's like, how can you really say that this one's the good guy when his mom died and he's just going around like it's another fucking day? Right. And it drove me crazy. So yeah, when I read that for school, like, that was my paper, was June is a piece of shit. Yeah. And here's why.
Right. And yeah, I think there's a lot of that in this. I think that's a really good comparison, actually. But that's one of the things that makes it, in my mind, such a great read. Like, this is one of those things where it's long, and it's a long read, but you don't want to stop. Right. I read this in 3 settings, basically, each story, because it's broken up into 3 acts, really. Sure. I read each act straight through each time and could not stop. And on the first 2 times, I would start burning into the next act and be like,
no,
I have to stop because I will read through the whole next one if I get invested in this one even a couple more pages. I have to stop now.
And again, pretty thick, and it's Ostrander, so that would have been like another 2 hours.
Right. It's very long. It's a good, for me, I think it was probably 7 hours of reading.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, I'm not the fastest reader. I like to really languish in what I'm reading, so your mileage may vary, but it's a lot of reading. Especially, I looked this up, as I'm wont to do on Amazon. $9 for a used copy shipped, $19 for a new copy shipped. Those are from third-party sellers, but that gives you an idea. If you don't mind a used copy, you can just boom Amazon $9 for like 7 hours of really, really deep reading. This is one of the heavier, weightier reads I've picked up in quite a while.
Definitely. It bothered me a little bit that Jeb visually aged and the kid Joshua really didn't.
He did some.
At the very end, it's like he shows up and, you could tell, like, just by the fact that he's a little bit taller and he dresses a little bit different than he's aged, whatever. But, yeah, visually, like, not as much. Which I think it really served the story, probably, because for a lot of it, he was supposed to be the naive young kid, that's trying to do well and stuff. But I also feel like I didn't get the ending for him that I wanted to, because he just showed so much, ambition and promise throughout the whole, like, first 2/3 of the book. And at the end, he's just, like, trying to kill somebody, and, like, that's his world. That's all we learn about him. We don't find out that he becomes, like, some high-dollar ass lawyer or, like, a doctor or something like that. Like, that's what I was expecting.
Well, we do literally find that out at the literal end.
Yeah.
That he becomes a lawyer and a politician, but it's more of an afterwards thing than, like, within the story itself. And frankly, I liked that about it.
It seemed to make it, like, more of a throwaway for me.
I liked that. I felt like his character kind of following in Nate's footsteps in a lot of ways made a lot of sense. Because Nate, through a lot of this story, like you said, he really does struggle with finding his place in a way. He creates purpose to have purpose.
Right.
Like, most of the things that he's driven by in here aren't particularly rational ideas or concepts. They're these high-minded ideals that he's just kind of latched onto for the purpose of having something to do, for driving himself forward. And that is interesting in a way to think about, like, the context of Superman and this character, because in a lot of ways...
Do you think he's like, what's his name, Jimmy or something?
Jimmy
Olsen?
No, I really feel like Nate really does embody in a lot of ways a lot of the ideas that we see with Superman later, but just in a really natural progression kind of way, rather than ham-fisting it and shoving it down your throat.
Yeah.
We see this guy who shows that they're a very stubborn family, like the way they learn to as they grow, the sort of values that they have are kind of to pick what you believe in and just stick to it regardless, right? And this is what we see a lot with Superman, this idea that he's got this whole, liberty and justice in the American way, and, like, it's his way or the highway, and it's just, that's the way it's going to be, and you can't convince him otherwise.
Sure.
And we see a very Western take on that idea, where even, his concepts are very similar to that, but it just plays out a lot differently in this time when it's, people with guns, and that's what you got.
Yeah. Mary, I wasn't as taken with as a character, but I'm super glad that she was in this, because we get, like, a very heavy, like, Native American perspective because she's in it, like, on her behalf. But yeah, she seems pretty static overall. You know? It is what it is.
Right. I was glad that they never, like, he doesn't go the route of fridging her right? She continues to be a strong character throughout, even though she has some really awful things happen to her.
Yeah,
she
that's
makes
one
a
of the
lot
things
of
I
her
like about her is like
own decisions.
She has like her own problems, you know?
Right.
She's kind of caught between like two worlds, you know, which I think is excellent, you know, for something like this. And it also pairs her with Joshua pretty well, you know, who's in the same boat.
Right. And this is full of a lot of passing in the night scenarios, right? This happens throughout. Because these characters are riding around horseback over, you know, an area of 4 or 5 states. But a lot of the things that they're dealing with are the same things. So they end up in the same places at close to the same time a lot of times. And he uses that a lot in here for the storytelling to move things forward, right? So we see Nate deal with somebody, and then we see Mary deal with them, and then guess who's next? Jeb shows up there, and he deals with these same people.
There's even a couple spots where Grandpa Kent's like, yeah, Jeb was like just a couple hours north of him at the time.
Right.
What are the odds?
Yeah.
You know, which is kind of hanging your hat on that, so I like that.
Right, I did too. I also, there's a lot of ancillary characters here. Wild Bill Hickok shows up a lot. And I think John Brown shows up a lot.
Who's that guy that Jeb was running around with? He's similar to Wild Bill. It's like the other gunfighter dude.
Well, I mean, there's Jesse James later on. He runs around with him.
Yeah,
but
that was the one I was thinking of.
Before that, it was Bill Anderson. And I can't remember who the other fellow's name is.
But yeah, that was cool. I would say Wild Bill is probably the biggest character that we get. It's kind of a side character. And I loved his character.
Right.
I love that they included the bit where he did his little like Wild West play variety show thing, whatever, and like they told him that it was terrible, and he fully agreed. You know, and again, he's got those morally ambiguous moments where, you know, he shoots a guy because like he lost a watch to him in a poker game, but it's also kind of about this girl.
Right.
So
there's a lot of that, and it's the interesting thing is that this story meanders about a lot, right? So we have all of these smaller stories that happen, and they don't just happen once, right? We don't just, now Wild Bill Hickok is here, and we'll have a couple issues where they're dealing with him. Rather, it's smattered through, and throughout the lifetimes of these characters, you know, they come across the same people over and over again, and we see where all of these different people are in their lives and how that plays off of the lead characters. And it adds a lot of continuity to something that otherwise would be very loose and hard to follow.
Right.
It's really cleverly done, using a lot of these more well-known characters and bringing them in repeatedly to kind of anchor down the story in a way.
Yeah, exactly. Anything else about the story before we talk about that?
No, not really. I think we've covered it pretty well. It's good.
So how about the art?
I like the art quite a lot.
It's good.
Yeah, it's really good. There's 2 different artists. One guy did the first 2, and then another guy takes over and does the third. And the transition is clear. You can tell when it changes, but there's a bit of a time jump in between that makes it work really well, I think.
Yeah, it was beautifully orchestrated, I guess, for lack of a better word. But yeah, it doesn't really strike me as like comic-y even. You know, it's got its own very sketchy kind of style to it. That, I mean, I can't directly point a finger and say, oh yeah, that reminds me of like this Superman or this Batman or something. I mean, it's very unique style used throughout this.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think it owes a lot more to the old like EC horror comics and Western comics from, you know, the 50s and 60s and early 70s than it does to like Superman or Batman or any of the stuff that DC has going on really during this time. But there's also some real touches that remind me of a lot of the 80s DC stuff that we love as well, the Swamp Things and the Animal Mans and stuff like that.
Sure.
Just in the stylistic choices of how partially some of the coloring, I think, is part of it. But also, like you said, the sketchy nature of it is a big part of it. Like it's playful in a way, in that you can tell they're really going for it in regards to giving it a vibe.
Yeah,
you know,
the perspective and like the framing. I was just looking at this, and it's like they were just so on point.
Right.
Like everything was exactly what it needed to be. Like no more, no less.
Right. There's a lot of mixture between close, expressive stuff and these very like wide vistas, and the way he moves between them, I think, really helps frame the story a lot. Both of these artists, I think, add a lot to this. With a more traditional, like, superhero comic booky looking artist, I think a lot would have been lost here. A more Jonah Hexy kind of vibe could have really killed this.
Sure. The last point, the colorist did an amazing job separating like scenes and tones and everything like that. Like you notice a drastic change in the coloring and like something's like about to happen.
Right.
And it's awesome.
Yeah,
and it's not the same trick that he uses over and over again.
It's not.
Like sometimes war is like sepia. Sometimes it's purple.
Right.
Right.
He uses a lot of there's a lot of empty space in the coloring. I think there's a lot of empty space in the art in general, but a lot of times a colorist, I think, will go in and try to liven things up, and he does a really good job of not overdoing things either. Especially, I guess in the late 90s it wasn't as big of an issue, but with the look of this, it would be easy to overdo it with the color, I think, or underdo it, and he finds a good medium.
Yeah, it's almost like realistic, but again, also playful at the same time. So it's a nice balance between those two.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it reminds me of a lot of the famous art from like the early 1900s that was made to represent this time that's being shown here. I know our own the Wichita Art Museum has like a lot of Western stuff.
Southwest floor.
And it really reminds me of a lot of the stuff that we have in there, which I love a lot of that work, with the lone gunman on the horse, with the sunset. Like there's
so
a lot of that kind of stuff.
Brass sculptures of horses, dude. You have no idea.
Yeah.
Like they're all there.
Yeah.
All of them.
Yeah. So all in all, man, this really, really exceeded my expectations by a large margin.
Yeah. So if you have any, even like a passing interest in like Civil War stuff, and you dig a slow pace.
Yeah, Civil War, Bleeding Kansas. If any of that sounds interesting at all, you'll love this. Also, if you have a soft spot for old school samurai or Western type things, Kurosawa or Sergio Leone, this is right in that wheelhouse as well, I think.
I didn't know that Ostrander wrote for Martian Manhunter. We're going to have to check that shit out.
Yeah, we will have to check that out.
I bet it's super tight.
It's probably pretty fucking cool.
Yeah. All right. The Kents. Ostrander, Truman, Mandrake, and Bear. Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr. Podcast, YouTube. Later.